So we would like to welcome David Connon to Jefferson. Mr. Connon, who is from Earlham, Iowa, has been doing research for many years on topics related to the Civil War. He is the author of several articles. Two of his great-great-grandfathers fought in the Union Army in the Civil War. But today, you probably thought you were here for the wrong topic, but today, his topic will be the Iowa Underground Railroad. Would you please welcome David?
Preacher, congressman, Negro stealer. Josiah Bushnell Grinnell was called all of these things during his lifetime. The third moniker, Negro stealer, came from participating in the Iowa Underground Railroad. J.B. Grinnell had help from other Grinnell residents, most of whom belonged to the Grinnell Congregational Church. At least 37 fugitive slaves passed through Grinnell on the Underground Railroad from Grinnell's founding in 1854 through 1860. These cases are documented. Less well-documented cases could push the number even higher. Iowa was, for the most part, a racist state before and during the Civil War. I'd like to explain what I mean. Belief in white superiority was the rule, but J.B. Grinnell was an exception. He believed that every human being is made in the image of God, and as such, is valuable and deserves respect. He also thought that all people should have equal rights. Such beliefs, believe it or not, were considered radical and even dangerous before the Civil War. Josiah Bushnell Grinnell was born in Vermont in 1821. His father died when J.B. was 10 years old. At a young age, J.B. worked hard and earned the trust of adults. He attended the Oneida Academy, a place designed to train young men to preach the gospel. But in reality, the school emphasized abolitionism and temperance. J.B. became a congregational minister. He served a church in New York State. The Reverend J.B. Grinnell preached about the Bible, heaven, hell, and the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. For example, in 1847, Reverend J.B. Grinnell asked in a sermon, "Why is it hard to believe that God can raise the dead?" He was a conscientious minister. On January 17, 1850, after writing a sermon, he wrote in his diary, "Today have done little, read newspapers too much. Oh, for a spiritual mind, sleep too much, do not pray enough." 2 months later, on April 1st, J.B. Grinnell performed the wedding of an African-American couple. Later that year, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. Under this act, federal marshals were able to force bystanders to help deliver slaves to their masters. This meant that abolition-minded citizens could be coerced into violating their consciences. To help a fugitive slave escape or avoid arrest could result in a huge penalty, up to a $1,000 fine and up to 6 months in jail. An early resident of Grinnell, Jesse Macy, called the Fugitive Slave Act one of the most barbarous pieces of legislation ever enacted by a civilized country. Sometime after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, J.B. Grinnell tried to start a congregational church in Washington, D.C., right in our nation's capital. He is credited with preaching a controversial anti-slavery sermon. During this period, he courted and married Julia Chapin. Now this is a picture of Julia later in life. Shortly after they married, J.B. took one of his frequent trips that would mark the rest of his life. He wrote his bride, "Commending you, my dear, to him who is our constant friend. I am your loving and affectionate husband." J.B. might have kept preaching in New York, but he developed a hoarse throat. So with sadness, he left the pulpit. He reports visiting Horace Greeley, the famous editor and publisher of the New York Tribune, asking for advice. J.B. already knew Greeley by serving as a freelance reporter for the Tribune. Have you heard the expression, "Go west, young man"? That's what Greeley told J.B., but he also told it to many other people too. Greeley mentioned that he needed someone to report on the Illinois Agricultural Fair. J.B. accepted this freelance assignment, but he left for Illinois with a dream of starting a colony of like-minded folks out west. After the fair, he looked into starting a settlement in Missouri, where his wife Julia had inherited land. But J.B. changed his mind when he learned that it was a strongly pro-slavery neighborhood. As a colleague of mine said, serendipity was his best friend. J.B. boarded a train in Illinois heading east, where he met two slave hunters on their way to return a fugitive slave. The slave hunters loudly cursed the North as made up of cowards and slave thieves. J.B. stood up and said, "I oppose slavery," and the men threatened him. An elderly passenger feared for J.B.'s safety. After the slave hunters had departed, the elderly passenger introduced himself as Henry Farnham, the man who financed the Rock Island Railroad. Farnham praised J.B. for standing his ground and suggested that he move to Iowa, where Farnham was going to build a railroad clear across the state. Farnham implied that a colony could be built near the rail line, and he told J.B. who to contact about the projected route of the railroad. J.B.'s dream, shadowy at first, was starting to take form. He could start a colony and preach in Iowa, as long as his throat held out. He quickly placed a notice in 2 New York papers calling for settlers of congenial moral and religious sentiments. But the settlers needed to have enough money to make the school and the church paramount and attractive institutions from the outset. 3 men read those words and met J.B. in Iowa. They were Henry Hamilton, the Reverend Homer Hamlin, and Dr. Thomas Holyoke. Those men and a handful of settlers hewed out a colony on the prairie. Their wives stayed back east. J.B. wrote Julia that he hoped he was laying foundations for a good colony and for us a home. Eventually the wives and children arrived. Most of the settlers lived moral lives and wanted to educate their children. They also opposed slavery, drinking, and the sale of liquor. An early settler and her husband arrived in the Grinnell colony on a hot summer day. They crawled inside their wagon and slept away the afternoon. They were awakened by singing. She had never heard music so sweet. She learned that the men had come in from their work and were having worship after supper. She said to her husband, "If we have got into a place where they will sing and pray when they are so tired, I think we have got in the right place." The couple started attending Thursday evening prayer meetings. She later recalled, "I know they did much to help us bear the trials and perplexities of our pioneer life." The Grinnell Congregational Church was the first church in town, and it was closely linked to the early history of Grinnell. Now, not everyone belonged to the Congregational Church, but Congregational church members did cooperate with and help other churches get started. On the national scene, U.S. Senator Stephen A. Douglas promoted popular sovereignty in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. This allowed settlers to determine whether the new state would be slave or free. Pro-slavery settlers, especially from Missouri, and abolitionist settlers, mainly from New England, poured into Kansas. The territory was a tinderbox. Pro-slavery men looted the town of Lawrence, and John Brown vengefully killed 5 pro-slavery men at Osawatomie. The conflict just ramped up. Now, the troubles in Kansas seemed very close to Grinnell residents. Leonard F. Parker stated, "Slavery and anti-slavery filled the air, and John Brown was arousing every man to thought and action." Literate Grinnell residents, both men and women, read the national and local newspapers and discussed slavery and Kansas in a lyceum. Now, you may know that a lyceum is a public meeting, kind of what we're having right now. The State Congregational Association of Ministers met in Grinnell in summer of 1856 and discussed the topic. They expressed indignation over the outrages that have been inflicted upon our fellow citizens of Kansas by hordes of armed men from Missouri for the purpose of crushing out liberty. Shortly afterwards, J.B. began campaigning for the Iowa State Senate. He served one term in Iowa City. During J.B.'s first year of service in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott, a slave, wasn't a U.S. citizen, and that Congress couldn't prohibit slavery in the territories. Later that year, the State Congregational Association declared that the Dred Scott decision is contrary to the Word of God and is the moral and civil assassination of the colored race who have rights that we should respect and maintain. The Congregational ministers advised all humane and Christian men to disregard its requirements. The next year, Kansas and the slavery question came home to Grinnell in a very personal way. 16-year-old Frances Overton was a slave in Missouri whose master apparently took her with him to Kansas. She escaped and made her way along the Underground Railroad into Grinnell in late 1858. She was fortunate to be in Grinnell. During Frances's stay there, J.B. Grinnell declared in a letter to the editor of the Iowa Statesman in Des Moines that runaway slaves were apt to be fed and warmed here. He very publicly, very boldly, was proclaiming this. Even better for Frances, the large Grinnell Congregational Church required members to oppose slavery. Members also agreed to respect the rights and privileges of others, regardless of natural, educational, or social differences. These people loved to emphasize the biblical text, quoting Jesus, "Inasmuch as ye have done it to the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me." Best of all, Frances found a home with Amos and Augusta Bixby. Amos was a lawyer and an early Grinnell settler. His law practice was very modest, so he farmed on the side, and Augusta worked as a housewife. The Congregational Church had been in their home in the early days. Frances couldn't read or write, so Augusta homeschooled her, besides caring for her own two young children. Frances was treated as a family member who shared in responsibilities and helped with household chores. Augusta learned that Frances didn't know that the earth is round. She also lacked religious knowledge. For example, when Frances saw a picture of Jesus Christ on the cross, she asked, "What are they doing to that man up there?" But she also had distorted religious knowledge. Over time, Frances confided in Augusta that her master's sons had sexually abused her. Years later, Amos reflected that hers was but the unhappy lot of slave girls since the world began. A few Grinnell residents thought it was wrong for Frances to live with the Bixbys. The dissatisfaction of a few increased after the Bixbys began taking Frances to Sunday school. 3 months later, Frances won a prize for memorizing the most scripture. Amos later recalled, "This caused offense to some white competitors." More controversy came to Grinnell a few months later when abolitionist John Brown and his party rolled into town bristling with weapons. It was an unusually warm Saturday in February. The roads were muddy with the blackest, stickiest substance one can imagine, so adhesive that men used to carry wooden paddles in their pockets to scrape it off with. Brown knocked on J.B. Grinnell's door saying he was a friend of Julia Chapin Grinnell's father. Brown stated, "I'm not here for a social visit. I am the awful Brown of whom you have heard, Captain John Brown of Kansas." Brown sought shelter for 2 nights, so he wouldn't have to travel on the Sabbath. Grinnell found housing for Brown, 12 fugitive slaves, and other armed men. Some stayed in the parlor of Grinnell's home, nicknamed the Liberty Room. Some stayed in his wool barn, and others in a local hotel. Curious people poured in from the countryside to see Brown's party, and J.B. invited him to speak that night. The room was packed on the second floor of the Grinnell School, a room used for congregational church services on Sunday mornings. For 2 evenings in a row, John Brown and his military aide, John Kagi, spoke to cheering crowds. The second night, 3 congregational ministers, including J.B. Grinnell, asked God to bless Brown. They urged listeners to give contributions to Brown. One of them also asked God to forgive Brown of any wrongful acts which he may have committed. Brown objected, saying he didn't ask forgiveness for anything he had done. J.B. Grinnell thanked Almighty God in behalf of the whole company for his great mercy and protecting care. Some in the crowd were upset. One was Nathaniel W. Clark, the father-in-law of Grinnell co-founder Dr. Thomas Holyoke. You can see on this tombstone the ship's anchor, befitting a former sea captain. So as I just mentioned, former sea captain, he had followed his daughter and Dr. Holyoke to Grinnell. Captain Clark knew that John Brown and his men had killed a Missouri slave owner and brought runaway slaves with them. Captain Clark saw those slaves as property, and therefore he thought John Brown was a murderer and a Negro stealer. Captain Clark resented J.B. Grinnell for honoring Brown. The next morning, John Brown and company stopped their wagons in front of the schoolhouse. Brown asked to speak with Leonard F. Parker, the superintendent and future historian of Powashik County. Joanna Harris Haynes was one of the school children who scurried out and gathered around Brown, who sat in the driver's seat of a wagon. She later wrote that some irrepressible pickaninnies pushed up the wagon cover and smiled. Before the party rode off to the Quaker settlement at Springdale, well-wishers pushed cakes into their hands. Isn't that an Iowa thing to do? In the following days, J.B. Grinnell worked with William Penn Clark to arrange for John Brown and company to have a free and safe conveyance to Chicago. Not long afterwards, some Iowa newspapers praised J.B. for welcoming Brown. Others criticized J.B. for letting John Brown speak in a church. One wag twisted J.B.'s name, calling him John, Brown, Grinnell. Decades later, Leonard F. Parker predicted, in years to come, it may seem remarkable that men stained with blood and planning to take still other lives were admitted with arms in their pockets to this church in February 1859. The town of Grinnell did sympathize with Brown, but it was an honor for him as a friend of an outraged Kansas, rather than as an emancipator of either Virginia or Missouri slaves. That summer of 1859, the fugitive slaves who had been with Brown were safe in Canada. In October, Brown's party attacked the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start a slave rebellion. Now instead, Brown was captured, tried, and hanged for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia. The hanging came on December 2nd, 1859, just 9 months after his appearance in Grinnell. Around this time, Amos Bixby decided to send Francis Overton to Grinnell School. He asked J.B. Grinnell's advice. J.B. asserted, send her to school, and if anyone dare oppose her, he can't stay in the town 24 hours, any more than if he had committed a rape. But J.B. underestimated Captain Clark and his like-minded friends. Francis flourished in Grinnell School and learned very fast, according to Augusta Bixby. Unfortunately for Francis, Captain Clark didn't want his children to attend school on terms of equality with fugitive Negroes. Therefore, he contacted Francis's master in Missouri and the slave hunter who had stopped near Grinnell. The slave hunter had tracked down 2 female slaves from Nebraska all the way to east central Iowa. Captain Clark reportedly told him that a nice piece of property known as Francis is unlawfully harbored in Grinnell. The Bixby's were frightened. Amos later wrote, under the fugitive slave law, the penalties for aiding or for harboring fugitive slaves were so severe that one might well dread them. You see, Amos was struggling financially in the lingering panic of 1857. He eked out a living, but he couldn't repay his own debts to even his own father, not to mention other people. Amos's reputation as an honest man was at risk. In these circumstances, a $1,000 fine would have been disastrous. But Amos and Augusta still sheltered Francis, likely because they cared for Francis as a person and they loved Jesus. Francis turned their garret, a room just underneath the roof, into a fortress. She reached it through a small hole in the ceiling where she could pull the ladder up after her. Francis kept weapons in the garret. Amos later wrote, if the slave hunters came, she could keep them at bay until the abolition town was aroused. We depended on men such as Harvey Bliss to rescue her. Now, Bliss was the town grocer who rode his wagon regularly to Iowa City. On at least one occasion, he carried a fugitive slave. Finally, the danger was so imminent that Amos asked school superintendent Leonard F. Parker to get Francis out of town. Parker also belonged to the Grinnell Congregational Church. That evening, between sunset and sunrise, someone drove a team northward carrying Francis. They intended for Francis to find a home among the Quakers in Hardin County, but they only made it as far as Timber Creek in Marshall County. On February 1st, 1860, Augusta Bixby grieved. My poor black girl is gone. Francis departed as Grinnell was in the midst of a religious revival that had started several weeks earlier. Local ministers, including J.B. Grinnell, had held afternoon and evening religious meetings Monday through Friday. Leonard F. Parker's wife, Sarah, wrote to her mother, our meetings are over, but the town is much changed. Captain Clark seems converted, and many of our most hardened ones are praying now. During the revival, a Quaker brought 4 large male fugitive slaves in their early 20s to Grinnell from Tabor in southwest Iowa. Grinnell residents offered them work. Sarah Parker explained that 2 of them wished to go back to Missouri after their wives and children. They were anxious to learn, and they asked to go to school. Their employers agreed until the spring work came on. It seems the fugitive slaves reasoned that they could better rescue their families if they could read guideposts and friendly written directions. Ella Parker referred to the 4 men as docile and patient. That probably helped them because they were placed in the lowest grade, and Edna Marsh Buck was their teacher. The children, according to Parker, were delighted with their woolly hair, curious pronunciation, and jolly good nature. But their presence offended many. Captain Clark, who had 4 daughters in school, was one who objected strongly. On Sunday, March 11th, 66 people joined the Grinnell Congregational Church. 62 of the new members professed faith in Jesus Christ as Savior. JB was seemingly out of town for this event. The following day was the annual Grinnell School meeting. It was usually just a routine event. But this year, Captain Clark plotted with like-minded men to eject the 4 male intruders. Ella Parker later said the men had hoped to outwit the abolitionists and make sad Caucasians happy evermore. When the meeting began, Captain Clark and his supporters moved to exclude non-residents from the school. Superintendent Ella Parker responded that the district would lose lots of tuition money. The motion was defeated. The dissenters forced another vote. Shall colored pupils be received in our schools? It passed by a small majority. One frenzied man said, "They shall never enter those doors unless over my dead body." Some residents verbally attacked Ella and Sarah Parker, both Oberlin College graduates, considered radicals. One resident slandered Sarah Parker and another Oberlin alumnus, Jane Cooper, with sexual innuendo. Augusta Bixby stood up for the Oberlin graduates, and the meeting adjourned. Determined men on both sides expected trouble at school the next day. Ella Parker arrived early Tuesday carrying a blackthorn walking stick. Captain Clark, holding a very large cane, and Samuel Scott Cooper entered the school and told the elementary teacher, Edna Marsh Buck, that they would drive the fugitives from her classroom. She went upstairs and found Parker. He flew down the stairs and confronted the men. Captain Clark and Cooper demanded that the fugitive slaves be kept out of the school. Parker said he would defend any student who was entitled to attend. They threatened him and left. Captain Clark and Cooper rejoined a mob that had formed outside the school. A block away, two of the African American students saw the mob with clubs and, it is supposed, concealed weapons. Anti-slavery men joined the black students and armed them with revolvers. One of the students climbed upon a pile of lumber and made a passionate speech. He said that if they must suffer so to gain their freedom and have all these indignities heaped upon them after they had gained it, they might as well die at once. The fugitive slaves then started across the churchyard toward the schoolhouse. Anti-slavery men persuaded them to turn back, although they preferred to fight their way through the mob and enter the school. Mob members called on anti-slavery men to disarm the fugitives, but they would not. For the fugitives' lives had been threatened, and they would not deprive them of the means of self-defense. Riot ran wild in the streets until noon. A short calm followed. Both sides discussed what to do next, with mob members loudly denouncing Ella Parker and the fugitives. Wednesday morning was as exciting as Tuesday. Sarah Parker wrote her mother, "Desperate deeds were meditated. Men, maddened with hate and rage, ran through the streets with insulting words ever on their lips. She feared that her husband might be injured or killed. But we all live. Though knives were whetted for hand-to-hand encounters, guns loaded, and pistols made ready." Sarah Parker later wrote, "The town is not settled yet. It will probably divide the Congregational Church, for several members were in the mob. The school closed, is to commence in 3 weeks." The school directors buckled under, and they changed the rules. They referred to the fugitive slaves as foreign students and required them to pay half of the tuition in advance. This prevented them from returning to school. But Amos Bixby's aunt, Sarah H. Bixby, dissented against the board's action. She opened her home as a private school for all colored people in town. Sarah Parker contemplated the revival that had preceded the riot. She quoted scripture, "When the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, Satan came also among them. So it has been here." The fugitive slaves lingered a while in Grinnell, working summer jobs on farms and attending Sarah Bixby's school. One of them stayed with Homer Hamlin and his family, and then they left town. Now, Captain Clark, he may have succeeded in driving the fugitive slaves out of the public school, but he suffered a personal loss. His 5-month-old grandson died shortly after the riot. The baby had been named after him. Captain Clark re-entered the fray less than 3 months later when more fugitive slaves arrived in Grinnell. He alerted newspapers in Iowa and St. Louis of this fact. On July 14, 1860, J.B. Grinnell wrote a note to William Penn Clark that he had sent forward 5 fugitive slaves, 3 women and 2 children, to neighboring Brooklyn. J.B. had learned that there was a reward of $1,000 offered for them at Nebraska City. About a month later, on August 13, 1860, 3 wagons carrying 15 fugitive slaves arrived in Grinnell. Captain Clark sent a detailed, hostile letter to the Iowa State Journal. He wrote that a grand abolition rally was got up at the schoolhouse to receive them. Captain Clark stated, J.B. Grinnell introduced them, who, he said, were Southern gentlemen traveling north for the benefit of their health, as was customary at this season of the year. And as they were rather short of funds, he called for a contribution. 3 days later, a writer for the Iowa State Journal claimed to have seen the 3 wagons full of fugitive slaves within 10 miles of Iowa City. The writer claimed that Amos Bixby, then a Republican candidate for county office, was chaperone of the wagon. Now, Captain Clark's original letter, noting the 3 wagons of fugitive slaves, had triggered a flurry of responses from J.B. Grinnell's supporters, including Captain Clark's very own son-in-law, Dr. Thomas Holyoke. Captain Clark sent a heated response to Dr. Holyoke's letter. In that letter, Captain Clark gave specific details about Francis Overton and the 4 male fugitive slaves. Using a broad brush, Captain Clark stated, as far as the town of Grinnell is concerned, it has a widespread reputation of being the most notorious rendezvous for stolen and fugitive Negroes west of the Mississippi. Many of them are ultra-abolitionists. Amos Bixby and S.F. Cooper are 2 of them, and all the ink that T. Holyoke ever put on paper can't blot it out. Captain Clark fired off a final letter on October 12, 1860. He wrote the journal editor that one of the 4 fugitive slaves had returned to call on Homer Hamlin. With the start of the Civil War, Captain Clark stopped his letter-writing campaign. However, his relationship with his son-in-law, Dr. Thomas Holyoke, deteriorated, if you can believe that. The state of Iowa charged Captain Clark with maliciously setting on fire a stack of wheat belonging to Dr. Holyoke. Dr. Holyoke testified that his father-in-law had feelings of the most malignant hatred and enmity toward him, and had made many threats. Dr. Holyoke said he had lived in continual fear of his father-in-law for a long time. The following year, 1863, Holyoke accused Captain Clark of sticking a pitchfork into his horse. The same year, J.B. Grinnell was elected to Congress. He introduced a resolution encouraging African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. The resolution passed. Afterwards, President Lincoln invited Grinnell to his office and said, "It's a great day for the black man when you tell him he shall carry a gun. It foretells that he is to have the full enjoyment of his liberty and his manhood." Lincoln concluded, "Now tell your people in Iowa, the time has come when I am for everybody fighting the rebels. Let the Indians fight them. Let the Negroes fight them. And if you have any strong-legged jackasses in Iowa that can kick rebels to death, they have my hearty consent." On another occasion, J.B. complained to Lincoln about dealing with Democrats in Congress. The president said, "Young man," now Grinnell was in his early 40s, "forget your annoyances. They are only as flea bites to mine. They are serious comedy, while I am in the focus of tragedy and fire." Now, debates on the floor of the House of Representatives sometimes became emotional, and J.B. sometimes made scathing remarks. After all, he was only human. Biographer Charles E. Payne notes that sometimes J.B. would accuse Democrats of being in league with slavery and the devil. After the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln's days were running out. J.B. was back in Grinnell on a Sunday morning, standing on his pastor's porch, when he heard that Lincoln had died. He later recalled, "Our grief was beyond expression. For the first time in my life, I fainted." After the Civil War ended, J.B. remained in Congress for a couple of years. Historian Payne observes, Grinnell's uncompromising attitude on Negro rights had made him many bitter enemies in the House who lost no opportunity to attack him. On one occasion, during a lull in the debate, a member from Kentucky rose and proposed that to relieve the tediousness of the hour, our pastoral brother from Iowa be invited to sing an abolition song. Quick as a flash, Grinnell was on his feet with the retort, "I'm not a good singer myself, but I will propose a verse from Isaac Watts and request the member from Kentucky to do the singing." Grinnell then repeated, "And are we rebels still alive? And dare we yet rebel? And is it not amazing grace that we are out of hell?" The response brought down the house, and JB was never again asked to sing. During his service as an Iowa State Senator and as a congressman, JB nearly always voted in favor of measures to help educate, empower, and equip African Americans. On 2 occasions, he voted against those measures as a matter of political expediency, of timing, but not a matter of principle. In 1890, near the end of his life, JB gave credit to God for driving him forth from his eastern home. JB said that he had hoped to elevate humanity and promote the cause of Christ. One of his favorite hymns had these words. "A charge to keep I have, of God to glorify, a never-dying soul to save, and fitted for the sky." If you know the second verse, please join in. "To serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. Oh, may it all my powers engage to do my Master's will." By reflecting on JB's life, it's possible to discern reasons for his exemplary actions. Several factors seem apparent. 1, he was probably a well-adjusted person who, as a child, knew he was loved. 2, he trusted Jesus Christ as his Savior, and he believed he was forgiven. 3, he embraced the teachings of the Oneida Academy, that slavery should be abolished and all people deserve respect. 4, he was surrounded and assisted by many like-minded people in Grinnell, including his wife, Julia. The last word on the March 1860 riot. It had taken time, as you can imagine, for the Grinnell Congregational Church to recover from the divisive effects of the riot. A petition actually went around the church, criticizing members who had opposed having fugitive slaves in school. The petition was dropped, but several years later, one erring member cheered a colored graduate of Iowa College, now Grinnell College. Other dissenters supported every radical step in favor of Negroes. I think JB would have approved. Thank you very much. Would any of you like to share any comments or questions? And I don't know if it'd be possible I could either repeat what I hear you say, or maybe we could pass around the microphone. I'm not sure how the dynamics and how the logistics should work, but...
So Chuck's not here, so please ask questions. Yeah.
Was Marshalltown also active in the Underground Railroad, do you know?
Ooh, that's a great question.
You said that Francis went through Marshalltown from Marshall County.
Right, in southern Marshall County. Pardon with me, I click through the slides. Okay, let's see. So, Marshall County is about roughly around here, I think. Oh, is it one county over? Okay, that it could well be. I'm not sure. I spent 6 years just focusing on Grinnell, which is a tiny little piece of the whole story of the Iowa Underground Railroad. So I don't. Does anybody else know, was Marshalltown residents active in the Underground Railroad?
had always heard rumors of that because my mother lived there for a while. And, I never knew that that was feasible, but at this point, these dots actually point to places you know that were active in the Underground Railroad, is that correct?
Yes. Underground Railroad researchers have found this. And I might mention here that the main route of the Underground Railroad pretty much roughly followed the route of Iowa 80 heading across Iowa. There were some smaller tributaries coming up from Missouri, and as I mentioned in the presentation, Francis was going northwest, heading for Hardin County, but ending up in southern Marshall County. So that was different than the main flow of the Underground Railroad. But this is, if you think Iowa 80, you're really on safe ground. Thank you for that comment, question. Yes, ma'am.
Years ago, I toured the Jordan House in West Des Moines.
Yeah.
Is it still available and open to the public?
It sure is. It's a great place to visit. Yes, yes. It's one of the few documented locations where people actually assisted other humans to find freedom on the Underground Railroad. A few existing in Iowa, that is.
Do you know the hours it's open now?
No, I don't. That's a great question. Oh,
David, we have a poster back here with 5 places in Iowa that you can visit.
great.
And I don't see Marshalltown on the map from the State Historical Society either. I'm kind of wondering about those dots, but it's south of there. But Jordan House, Sarah, can you read Jordan House?
Jordan House is on here.
It's on the bottom.
Tour Fridays and Sundays, 11 to noon or 1 to 2.
So there's some books back there if you want to learn more. There's a poster of the 5 places that you can visit in Iowa, but I'm not real clear about Marshalltown
Yeah.
either.
And where they are here on the map, so that might give you a better idea. And that does have their hours of operation and their phone numbers right here on there.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. One moment, please. I'd just like to mention the best single book that I've come across about the Iowa Underground Railroad is by a man called Lowell Soyke. He is one of the Iowa's leading Underground Railroad researchers, had worked with the State Historical Society of Iowa for years. The name, there it is. And what's the name? What's the book called?
Necessary Courage.
Necessary Courage. It is a great
Available at
book.
your local library.
Yes. Visit the library. Jefferson Public Library. It's great. Yes, ma'am.
There was a photograph that you showed, and I believe the name was Joanne Harris Haynes.
Yes.
But then I didn't hear you speak of her.
Okay. She was she's a teacher of school children in the Grinnell School. She wasn't a teacher. I'm sorry. She was one of the school children who, when John Brown's party arrived, the Monday after John Brown had spoken for the second night in a row, she's one of the school kids who ran out to gather around John Brown in his wagon to take a look at the famous man. Yes, they did. You know, kids are kids. And so that's all I know about Joanna Harris Haynes. Although the Harris families, it was pretty prominent in early Grinnell. That much I can say. And if I'm not mistaken, one of her brothers served in the Union Army. But I don't remember more off the top of my head. I have plenty on my laptop, but you're welcome. Thanks for asking. Yes.
My husband's first cousin is from the rural Earlham area.
Oh, really?
Martha and Mott.
Okay.
Anyway, they lived on a farm, between Earlham and Dexter area.
Sure.
And they had, their house was rented, of course, the farm was rented. But they knew that it had been on the Underground Railroad. And one Sunday, Martha had taken some old gummies, she made out of clothing, and put them in closets. Because that's where they hid them, was behind the clothes and upstairs closets. And also in the basement, of course. But we had quite a bit of information.
Sure. Thanks for sharing that. Yes, Earlham, the town where I live, is credited with being on the Underground Railroad, particularly north, and it might be east or west of town, I'm not sure, but yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Did I see another hand? Sir?
Do you know where the term Underground Railroad came from? Who coined that term?
I don't. I think there's some debate over the bragging rights to that term. So there have been at least 2 or 3 different accounts of how that originates. I can't credit anyone as being authoritative. It's a great question. Anybody else? I want to thank you and Margaret, Sarah, Jane, and all of you for coming and sharing this afternoon together and sharing it with me. Have a good rest of the day. If you have any questions or comments afterwards, I'll be around for a while.
Thank you.